How's it going, everyone? My name is Michael Doherty, and I did Identifying and Reducing Aircraft Pollution as my research topic. So, why should you care about this research? The first is noise pollution. If you live in any big city like we all are right now, or most of us are, or if you've ever driven through a large metropolitan area, you'll know that aircraft are super loud. So, over the past few decades, more and more noise restrictions have been coming into place just to protect the people around these large airports. Climate change is a huge thing right now, so reducing these aircraft emissions can have a huge impact on this climate change. Uh, the cost of these reduced emissions is usually higher than the engine operating right now, which is why these emissions haven't been put into place. Those prices are going to get pushed onto consumers if they're enacted. And the geopolitical climate is unstable, is the best word for it at the moment. And having access to alternative fuels and maybe electric aircraft and all these uh, techniques to lower emissions can hopefully stave off the instability formed by geopolitical stuff happening across the world. And then the future of what we're going to be working in essentially is going to be affected by these emissions. I mean, electric aircraft, more efficient engines, all sorts of things like this is where the future of our careers are probably going to be. And even if you're not directly in these, you're going to be affected by them. So the first research was aircraft optimization for minimum environmental impact. And this study found a trade off between bypass ratio and cost. So, as you can see on the top right table there, as bypass ratio increases, relative cost also increases. And that bottom right one, there's an inverse correlation between bypass ratio and noise, meaning that indefinitely just increasing the bypass ratio is going to reduce your noise level. But obviously, there's a sweet spot there between the cost to the airline and just reducing or increasing your bypass ratio, so your engine's essentially ineffective. And the study looked at a cheap operating cost versus low noise output between two aircraft designs, and they found that the lower noise version was only 1%, 1% more relative cost, meaning that this is technically a viable thing that airliners could be putting into place, but obviously they're not going to without some sort of regulation pushing them to. The second study was aircraft trajectory optimization for contrail avoidance. They found that optimizing the aircraft's trajectory, flight path can save fuel or reduce emissions significantly, and there are indications that persistent contrail formation can lead to adverse climate change from what they studied. And the study looked at persistent contrail formation zones at 3 hour blocks, three separate 1 hour blocks with and without altitude optimization for 12 airport pairs. So I'll show you what that looks like here. On this chart, the colored blobs are at 30,000 feet, where essentially in that zone, if the aircraft flies through it, there's going to be almost 100% chance of contrails forming persistently, just constant. And these are the 12 airport pairs that they looked at, and just a visualization of them flying through some of those zones. So the results from this, they found a trade-off between flight level, contrail formation, and fuel consumption. So if you overlaid these two plots on each other, you would see that higher fuel consumption means less contrail formation because you can avoid these pockets. But obviously, there's a sweet spot somewhere in there because you don't want to be consuming a ton of fuel to avoid these, but you also don't want to just be flying straight through these pockets. So here we see three separate sample flight paths for one pair of airports. As you can see, you can avoid all these pockets altogether. You can just skim part of them, or you can just fly straight through on the most optimized path. And they found that altitude optimization is best for avoiding contrails, so just avoiding these altitudes altogether. The blue line there shows without altitude optimization, and the green line is width. So you can see that even with 2% additional fuel consumption, if you optimize for altitude, you can significantly avoid forming these contrails. And they only looked at certain conditions like weather and times and airports, but they said that this is significant enough that these should be expanded to more of those. So the third is emissions and thermodynamic performance simulation of an industrial gas turbine. They simulated cases like variables like power, inlet conditions, fuel concentrations, and they found that methane concentration increasing 92 to 98 resulted in significant increases in emissions. The first of these being that carbon monoxide was increasing from 0.14 to 0.19 parts per million at the combustor exit, and the second being that nitrogen monoxide was increasing too. And as we can see on the right there, the temperature as it increased with all of their cases that they simulated, higher temperature just means higher emissions. And I mean, that's consistent with the first study, which found that like higher bypass ratio means less flow going through the combustor and the core of the engine, which means less temperature overall. So the fourth one was combustion emissions characteristics of a turbine engine fueled with HEFA blends. So HEFA blends are hydroprocessed esters and fatty acid fuels. So used cooking oils, camelina feedstock, so stuff with the essential components that fuel needs, but just a little bit different. And they found that the thrust was the same across these two. And then these are the emission results. As you can see on the far left there, CO2 went down significantly on the order of like 40 to 50 at each RPM. Nitrogen monoxide did go up for both of them, but as you can see, the order is on the magnitude of like 0.2 to 0.3, not super significant. And then O2 and carbon monoxide were down as well, but those aren't as relevant to emissions as the other two. So the last study looked at the trade-off between the climate impact of aviation, carbon dioxide emissions, and contrails. So essentially, looking at how contrails affected aviation emissions. This study didn't optimize for altitude like the other one did. They found that optimizing for altitude means you're flying these engines at altitudes that they're not used to, and their performance would suffer because of it. They still looked at contrail formation, but they used CO2 as their main standard for like testing all of their emissions, just because they found it to be more consistent than just saying, hey, 20 minutes of contrails is gonna do this to the climate. It's a little harder to predict than CO2. And they looked at time horizons of 20, 50, and 100 years and its effect on the climate. So they were saying, like, hey, we have this engine burning at this. How's it going to affect if the environment if we keep burning it at that rate for these time horizons? And they found that adding 100 kilometers of distance to a flight to avoid making a contrail is beneficial for climate change, but again, comes down to cost for the airlines to do this. So to summarize, bypass ratio can reduce noise and gas emissions. Avoiding certain pockets of air can be beneficial to emissions. Lower combustion temperatures mean less emissions in general. Alternative jet fuels are readily available that provide similar thrust. They just need to be integrated correctly into the engine, built around the engine. And adding flight distance to avoid contrails reduces emissions significantly. And the biggest thing here to note is cost. So if it's not cost effective to the airline, they're not going to do it. That's why these things aren't in place right now. I mean, an airline's not going to increase their operating cost by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% just because it emits less, unless there's some sort of subsidy or regulation that's going to force them to do this. So, thanks for listening to me. That's all I got.